The air in the room is cold, the stone floor frigid beneath her feet. The mother holds the newborn close. She has checked him herself, over and over. He seems perfect. He seems strong. She clings to the false hope that the inspection will be swift, that he will pass. But the ticking clock has already run out. The sound of heavy sandals echoes in the corridor. The door opens. The elders enter, their faces impassive. They do not look at her. They barely look at the child. The public myth insists they are here to judge his future strength, to see if he is worthy of Sparta. That the weak are taken to the cliffs of Taygetus. A quick, brutal fall. But they don't reach for the infant. One elder unrolls a ledger. He finds the family name. He makes a mark. They are not here to judge a warrior. They are here to take inventory. And the mothers who learned this too late knew. The myth of the cliff was a mercy. The truth was the ledger. Because the state didn't just discard its rejects, it hunted them. We are venturing into a darkness others are afraid to see. Subscribe to walk this path with us. Hit the bell. Let it be your signal when we unseal the next forbidden chapter. And now, back to the story. The elders left. The room was silent again. Just the sound of the wind, the cry of the infant. The mother held the child to her chest. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from confusion. She had prepared for a verdict, a sentence, a yes, he lives, or a no, he dies. She expected the final walk to the cliffs. She got paperwork, a simple check mark in a book. The story, the one everyone knew, was far more direct. Plutarch wrote it down. It became legend. The law of Lycurgus was absolute. A child was not the property of the father. It was the property of the polis, the state. Within days of birth, the father, not the mother, would carry the male infant to the lesh, the club, a public hall. There, the elders of the tribe, the Gerousia, would convene. They were not sentimental. They were appraisers. This was quality control. They would examine the child in the cold light. They were looking for euthanasia kai Rome, good physique and strength. They turned the child over. They felt the spine. They checked the limbs. They studied the shape of the head. Was it sturdy and strong? If yes, the order was given. Rear it, train it, make it a Spartan. But if the child was ill-born and deformed, the verdict was swift. This was not a child. It was a burden, a useless mouth, a future drain on resources, a weak link in the future phalanx. The state could not afford parasites. The father was ordered to take the infant to the Apothecae, the deposits, a deep chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus. The child was left there, or thrown, abandoned to the elements, to the wolves. A quick, efficient removal, a brutal mercy. This was the public image of Sparta, strength as the only virtue, weakness as a contamination. The system was lauded. It created the perfect warrior. It guaranteed the supremacy of the state. It was a brutal, simple system, or so it seemed. But there was one detail, one fact, that made no sense. For centuries, historians and archaeologists have searched the Apothecae. They have excavated the chasm at the foot of Taygetus. They found bones, thousands of them. But they were not the bones of newborns. They belonged to men, adults, aged 18 to 35, the refuse of war or traitors, not infants. The story of the cliff was neat, it was tidy, and it was a lie. No infant bones. Not at the cliff, not in the chasm. The ground was searched. The earth was sifted. The story, repeated for millennia, shattered on the cold, hard science of archaeology. The legend of the Apothecae was a ghost story, a convenience. So what happened? What happened to the ill-born and deformed? If they were not killed, they still vanished. They did not grow up as Spartiates. They were not seen in the agog, the brutal state training. They did not join the phalanx. They did not become citizens. They were gone. We must look back at the inspection. The hook, the elders in the cold room, the mother waiting, the scroll, the ledger, the check mark. This was not a trial. It was an intake, a classification. The Spartan state was not a family. It was a corporation, and it had two primary assets: the homoioi, the equals, or Spartiates, the pure-blooded perfect warrior citizens, and the helots, the state-owned slaves. The public myth said the helots were a conquered people. The Messenians, captured in war, bound to the land, forced to farm, to serve, to bleed for their masters. They outnumbered the Spartiates 7-1, maybe 10-1, a massive, seething population of the subjugated. They were the engine that ran Sparta, but populations need replenishment. Wars, disease, and the cryptaia, the secret police that hunted helots for sport and training, all took their toll. The state needed a constant, fresh supply of slaves. This was the crack, the plot hole. What happens when two equals produce something unequal? A child with a club foot, a weak constitution, a visible imperfection. Does the state simply discard a valuable resource? A body that could still work? A pair of hands that could farm, or build, or serve? Sparta was, above all, pragmatic. It was pathologically efficient. It wasted nothing. The elders were not judges passing a death sentence. They were auditors. They were sorting assets. This one is Spartiate. He will be trained. This one is defective. He will be reclassified. Why the discrepancy? Why the elaborate lie about the cliff? What were they hiding? The myth of the Apothecae was horrific. It painted the Spartans as monsters who murdered their own children for the sake of purity. A brutal but honest atrocity. But the truth was worse. The truth was the ledger. The check mark was not a death sentence. It was a reclassification. The horror wasn't a quick fall from a cliff. It was a social erasure. The child was not discarded. It was reassigned. The elders, those cold auditors of flesh, were the first cog in a bureaucratic machine. When a Spartiate child was deemed imperfect, it was not destroyed. It was simply not Spartiate. It lost its birthright on the stone floor of the inspection room. This child, born of equals, was now unequal. It was cast down. It would be given to a helot family to be raised, not as a citizen, but as a slave. It would grow up on the land its parents owned. It would farm the fields it was meant to inherit. It would serve the brothers and sisters who had passed the inspection. It was a ghost in its own home, a living defective, banished to the underclass. This was the state's cold pragmatism. Why destroy a future laborer? Why waste a body that could toil? The state needed helots. It bled helots dry through the cryptaia and constant war. And when the supply from conquered lands ran low, it simply manufactured more from its own bloodline. This was the fate the mothers truly feared. Not the Apothecae, but the ledger. This is why some tried to hide their children. They were not running from a quick, merciful death. They were running from a lifetime of servitude for their child. They were trying to escape the state's inventory, to keep their child off the books. Because to be noted as imperfect was to be unpersoned. This was the true mechanism. Inhuman, precise, a social murder that left the body intact. But why? Why create the lie? Why invent the spectacular, brutal myth of the cliff? The lie wasn't to protect the victims. The lie was to protect the Spartans, to hide their true purpose. The lie was the shield. The true purpose was twofold. First, Sparta needed to maintain its labor force. The helot class was the foundation of the state. It had to be replenished. Enslaving their own imperfect children was a cold, pragmatic, internal harvest. It was efficient. Second, the lie protected the myth of the homoioi, the equals. They sold themselves as a master race, direct descendants of Heracles, perfect in form, perfect in spirit. What happens to that myth if the world sees that this master race produces defects? What happens if those defects are seen working the fields, serving wine, living as slaves? It shatters the illusion. It proves the bloodline is flawed, fallible, human. The Spartans could not allow that, so they created the public myth. The story of the Apothecae was a masterpiece of propaganda. It was a distraction. It took their greatest hypocrisy, the fact they created slaves from their own blood, and masked it with an act of honest brutality. The world was meant to look at the cliff and say, they are monsters, but they are pure. The lie hid the truth. The truth was not brutal purity. It was calculated, bureaucratic, farming. They weren't culling the weak. They were harvesting them. The public myth made them look like predators. The truth revealed they were not ranchers. This perfect, dark system, how did it finally break? It didn't. It worked. It functioned perfectly until Sparta itself collapsed. The state fell, but the lie was stronger. The story of the cliff was so good, so brutal, so Spartan, that the world believed it for 2,000 years. The truth didn't come from a confession. It didn't come from a helot rebellion. It came from the dirt. It came from archaeologists who finally went to the cliff, who dug in the chasm. They were looking for the bones of infants. They found none. They found only the truth, the absence. The story was hollow. The real victims were never thrown. They were absorbed, erased from one book and written into another. So what was worse than the quick fall from the cliff? What was the fate hidden behind the elders' cold gaze and the checkmark on the scroll? It was the ledger. It was the key practice. Bureaucratic erasure. The child wasn't murdered. It was reassigned, stripped of its name, its blood right, and its future. It was cast down into the helot class, becoming a slave to the very family it was born into. They hid their true purpose, the internal harvesting of flawed citizens to replenish their slave economy, behind the mask of the public myth. They needed the world to believe they were pure. The real horror wasn't the Apothecae. It wasn't the quick death. It was the lie. It was the cold, pragmatic truth that a lifetime of slavery was more efficient than a quick execution. We have recorded another chapter, but the darkness in this chronicle is endless. If you believe this must be remembered, subscribe to this archive. Press like as your seal upon this record, and hit the bell. Let it toll for those whose names we must remember.